All right, so here is our sine graph. Okay, so y equals sine of x. Now what we're going to do with our sine graph here is we're going to find the domain, the range, the amplitude, and the period. Okay, so let's start with domain. Now a reminder to you guys that the domain is our x values of the function. Okay, so we're trying to figure out, well, is this function continuing on forever and ever and ever, or is it not continuing on forever and ever and ever? Well, here's what I know about the sine function. Even though it's not shown on here, there are arrows. So we are going to continue on in the negative direction, and we're going to continue on in the positive direction. So for our domain, we have all real numbers. There are no limits to our possibilities for those x values. Now let's do the range. Now as a reminder, the range is the y values of the function. Well, if we look at our key points, we've got 1 and -1, and I think it repeats over and over and over again because it is periodic. So we oscillate between these two y values and everything in between. So our range is going to be from -1 to 1. And because those values are included, we have brackets. Okay, now let's address the new stuff that we just learned about. So let's start with amplitude. So a reminder to you guys, the amplitude is the distance from the midline to the maximum or the midline to the minimum, because it should be equidistant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just look and see, okay, my midline, it looks like it is y equals 0. This was not the smoothest line I've ever drawn. Okay, this is my midline right here, y equals 0. So if I go from my midline to my maximum point, that's 1. So it's this distance right here. Or from the midline to the minimum, which is also 1. We're not going to account for the fact that from the midline to -1, that is a negative value, but when we're talking about amplitude, it's always positive. So because the distances are exactly the same, the amplitude is 1. Okay, we have the period left. Now, remember that the period is the horizontal distance it takes to complete one whole cycle. Now, if we remember our values from the unit circle really, really well, we know that we start at 0. Trace, 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 trace. We haven't started to repeat yet. We start to repeat right here, though, at 2 pi 0, because it does start to increase in value. So if we look at our x values, that distance is from 0 to 2 pi. So the period length is going to be 2 pi. Not that bad, right, guys? Okay. Now, this function right here is the cosine function. So y equals cosine of x. Now, in relation to the unit circle, the sine function that we just saw was following the y values around the unit circle. Cosine of x is following the x values of the unit circle. So just recapping a little bit of stuff that we talked about in the last video. Okay, same thing, domain, range, amplitude, and period. Okay, so our domain. Well, it's kind of the same idea with this function. Even though it doesn't show it, it is continuing on forever and ever in both directions. So our domain is going to be all real numbers. Wahoo! Range. Same idea. This is our y values of the function. Now, even though it looks a little different, it really has a lot of the same values. Okay, here's our highest point. Okay, on the y's? It's 1. It is not any other value but 1. Our lowest is -1. So just like our sine function, our range on the cosine function is going to be from -1 to 1. Okay, before we do amplitude, because we have amplitude next, let's draw the midline, which, if we see this right here, it's all based off of the x-axis. So guess what? X-axis is back as our midline. Okay, so from the midline to our maximum point, we go from 0 to 1, and it's the same thing when we go from our midline to our minimum. We have an amplitude of 1, so that is our amplitude. And we have period. Now for our period this time, we're going to start right up here. Okay, we're going to pick this point. I like that point. We're going to continue through the cycle until it starts. Well, we're going to continue until we repeat this whole cycle. Da 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 da. And we're going to stop right here because then we start to decrease after that, just like when we started. So our starting point was 0, and our ending point was 2 pi. So our period length for this one is also 2 pi. Now, let's do some comparisons here. Our sine function has all of that same information. Okay, so far we have the exact same information. The difference that we see then is the shape. Okay, where we're actually starting for these two functions. So remember that the sine function is following the y values of the unit circle, whereas our cosine function down here, this one's following the x values of the unit circle. But hopefully this helps you see how you can find domain, range, amplitude, and period on these functions. Okay, good luck, guys.